When the sun rose over La Forbie, no one knew they were marching into the grave of an entire era, an annihilation so total it erased the very spine of the Crusader States. The dust of Palestine hung in the early light like a thin veil, turning the horizon into a trembling mirage. Along the plain near the village of La Forbie, the Christian host gathered, Knights Templar, Hospitallers, Barons of Outremer, and the ragged remains of forces still reeling from the loss of Jerusalem a year earlier. Among their banners fluttered exhaustion, desperation, and a brittle hope that this battle might finally halt the relentless tide consuming the Crusader States. The commanders knew the stakes. Jerusalem had fallen not to the traditional enemy, but to the Khwarezmians, a brutal, rootless horde displaced by the Mongols, carving their wrath across the Levant. Now these warriors joined the Ayyubids of Egypt, forming a coalition far deadlier than anything the Crusaders had faced in decades. In the Christian camp, the tension burned like a fever. The Templar marshal, Armand de Périgord, walked the lines, his jaw clenched with the stubborn pride his order was famous for. "Hold formation," he barked, his voice slicing through the desert air. "Break and you die. Stand, and perhaps the Lord wills us victory." Nearby, Walter of Brienne, Count of Jaffa and the nominal commander of the Allied army, watched the swelling enemy forces with a grim expression. He had fought a lifetime of battles, but nothing in his experience matched the storm forming across the plain. The Khwarezmians moved like wolves in restless circles, while the Egyptians formed disciplined ranks behind them. Tens of thousands, hungry for slaughter, yet within the Christian lines simmered internal conflict. Their allies, the Galilean and Damascene Arab contingents, urged a defensive posture behind fortifications. The military orders wanted an aggressive advance, and Brienne, politically pressured and outnumbered in military authority, leaned toward the advice of the Templars and Hospitallers. In the shade of a battered tent, a brief council erupted into sharp voices. "They will devour us if we sit and wait," a Templar insisted. "They will outflank and crush us if we advance," replied an Arab commander calmly. Brienne raised a hand, silencing both. "We cannot retreat," he said quietly. "The fate of the kingdom stands here." Outside, drums thundered across the enemy camp, deep, rolling, and merciless. La Forbie was about to become a furnace, and inside it the Crusader world would burn. Dawn's first heat had barely touched the plain when cracks in the Allied army widened into silent fault lines. Though they stood shoulder to shoulder, the Crusaders and their Muslim allies from Damascus were bound less by trust than by immediate necessity. Each man saw the coming battle through a different lens, some driven by faith, others by vengeance, and many simply by the instinct to survive another day in a land drowning in conflict. At the heart of the camp, Walter of Brienne gathered his corps commanders. His face, carved by exhaustion and the strain of leadership, held an urgency he tried to mask. "We march forward," he declared, eyes sweeping the room for resistance. "If we sit behind entrenchments, the Khwarezmians will tear at our flanks until we die in the dust. Better to strike first." The Damascene commander, Al-Mansur Ibrahim, folded his arms, the lamplight catching the steel in his gaze. "Your knights are bold," he said, "but boldness is not strategy. Their mobility will outmatch you in the open. This field favors them." Armand de Périgord leaned forward, Templar cloak whispering against the ground. "We are not debating cowardice. We are debating salvation. If we retreat or hide behind earthworks, our men will think us broken, and broken soldiers don't win battles." A tense silence thickened the tent. The smell of hot iron and sweat clung to the air. Finally, Walter spoke, his voice quieter but colder. "We cannot appear weak. Jerusalem has fallen. If we retreat again, not a soul in the Levant will believe the Crusader States can be saved." Reluctantly, the Damascenes agreed, yet their faces carried the grim expression of men signing a contract with disaster. Outside, the Christian knights prepared their mounts, tightening straps and whispering private prayers. A young hospitaller named Raymond looked toward the enemy lines with something between awe and dread. "Do you think any of us will live to see nightfall?" he asked. His captain didn't answer. He simply placed a gauntlet hand on Raymond's shoulder before riding off. Across the plain, Khwarezmian horsemen taunted the allied host, galloping close enough that dust sprayed into Christian shields. Their war cries rose like sparks in dry grass, sharp, wild, infectious. The armies had not yet clashed, but the outcome was already taking shape. Inside the fragile alliance, doubt gnawed like worms in old wood, and soon the whole structure would collapse. The sun climbed higher, turning the plain into a shimmering furnace. Across the field, the Khwarezmian horde tightened its formation, not with the rigid discipline of European knights, but with the fluid, predatory motion of hunters scenting blood. Their banners, tattered from years of wandering exile, fluttered like the wings of carrion birds gathering before a feast. Their leader, Huzam Aldin Burkhan, rode along the front ranks. His armor was mismatched, scavenged from a dozen conquered foes, but his presence radiated an undeniable force. He raised his curved sword, and the horde answered with a roar so fierce it rippled across the plain like an earthquake. These were men who had lost their homeland to the Mongols, who fought not for territory or honor but for the raw satisfaction of destruction. Behind them, the Ayyubid army formed a more ordered second line. Shields gleaming, lances angled, archers already planting their feet. The Egyptians watched the Khwarezmians with an uneasy mix of respect and caution. They had allied with wolves, and once unleashed, wolves followed only their own appetites. From the allied Christian camp, the sight was terrifying. Hundreds of horse archers peeled off, spreading like a dark tide, circling, weaving, testing the lines with predatory precision. Their arrows sparkled in the sun like flecks of burning metal. A Templar knight spat into the dust. "They're everywhere," he muttered, gripping his lance. "Like shadows with teeth." On a slight ridge, Walter of Brienne studied the movements with narrowed eyes. "They want us to break formation," he said to Armand de Perigord. "Force us into a charge." Armand allowed himself a tight smile. "Charging is exactly what we excel at." "But on their terms," Walter replied. "That is what worries me." Before the Templar marshal could answer, the first wave of Khwarezmian arrows hissed through the air. Shields thudded, horses reared. A squire fell, a shaft buried in his throat. The lines held, but tension rippled through them like a pulled bowstring ready to snap. Still, the Khwarezmians did not commit. They danced just out of reach, releasing torrents of arrows, laughing, daring the Crusaders to lunge. And among the allied ranks, the strain grew unbearable. Impatience gnawed at the nightly orders. The Damascenes shouted warnings. Tempers frayed. Horses snorted and pawed the ground. The Khwarezmians were not attacking. They were tightening the noose. The noonday heat pressed down like a smothering hand. Sweat ran beneath armor, tempers sharpened, and discipline frayed. The Crusader lines, battered by arrows and mock charges, trembled on the edge of erupting into chaos. All the while, the allied Damascene troops begged for restraint, their calls drowned beneath the clatter of restless European steel. Walter of Brienne rode along the front, trying to steady the ranks. Every few steps he saw another man collapse from an arrow strike or from the oppressive heat. His horse snorted nervously, sensing the building storm. When Walter reached a small rise overlooking the field, he finally saw what the Khwarezmians intended. They were herding the Crusaders into impatience, coaxing them toward a reckless charge. Armand de Perigord galloped up beside him, visor raised, face burning with anger. "We cannot endure this punishment," he growled. "If we stay still, they'll pick us apart like vultures." Walter didn't answer immediately. Below them, the Damascene commander, Al-Mansur Ibrahim, waved frantically, signaling them to hold back and wait for the Egyptians to advance first. His voice reached them only in faint, desperate echoes. "Not yet. Hold your men." Armand scoffed. "They want us to hide behind them again. Enough of this." A Hospitaller rider approached, armor dented, blood on his sleeve. "Marshal, our men are begging for the order. They cannot endure another hour of this harassment." Walter watched the Khwarezmian horse archers swirling like a living storm. He knew exactly what the enemy wanted. And yet, if he refused to act, his army would crumble from attrition. If he advanced, he might be charging straight into a trap. There was no good choice left. "Sound the advance," Walter finally said, voice low but steady. "We hit them hard. All knights forward." Armand bowed his head once. "God wills it." Horns blared. Standards dipped. Thousands of hooves thundered as the Crusader cavalry surged into motion. Dust exploded beneath them, cloaks streaming, lances lowering in a glittering forest of steel. The sight was magnificent, terrifying, like the last glorious heartbeat of a fading world. The Damascenes shouted in horror, scrambling to adjust their lines. "You fools! Not yet! You doom us all!" But momentum had swallowed everything. The Crusader charge, unstoppable, magnificent, and disastrously premature, raced straight toward the waiting jaws of the Khwarezmian tempest. The thunder of hooves rolled across the plain like the roar of a collapsing cliff. Thousands of Crusader knights surged forward, Templars in stark white mantles, Hospitallers in black, secular knights bearing the battered colors of Outremer's last baronies. For a moment, it looked like a vision torn from earlier victorious centuries, when Christian cavalry charges split enemy armies like axes through wood. But this was 1244, not 1099. The world had changed. The Khwarezmians did not stand and receive the charge. They flowed back like water, peeling away in elegant, terrifying discipline. Their horses moved as if guided by a single mind, retreating just far enough to stay out of reach, all while unleashing clouds of arrows into the tightly packed Crusader ranks. Shields rattled. Men grunted as shafts tore through mail. Horses screamed. Yet the knights pushed on, lowering their lances with furious determination. They had to believe, that if they simply hit hard enough, the enemy line would crack. Instead, they found nothing but dust and death. Templar Marshal Armand de Perigord shouted, "Forward! Close with them! Close with them!" His voice was half command, half desperation. Each time the knights neared the fleeing horse archers, the Khwarezmians darted away again, firing backward with uncanny accuracy. The air shimmered with the constant hiss of arrows. A young knight named Raymond, face smeared with sweat and blood, glimpsed a Khwarezmian rider only 20 paces away. "I have him!" he yelled, spurring his horse. For 3 desperate seconds, victory seemed within reach. Then 3 arrows punched into his chest in the blink of an eye. He slid from the saddle without a sound. The Crusader formation stretched thin as faster riders pushed ahead while wounded horses faltered. Gaps opened, lines bent. What began as a unified assault slowly unraveled into scattered clumps of exhausted men chasing ghosts. Behind them, the Damascene infantry watched in horror. They had begged the Crusaders to hold, to fight defensively where their infantry and archers could support them. Now the knights were a mile ahead, deep in enemy manipulation, blind to the traps snapping shut around them. Walter of Brienne rode at the center, sweat streaming down his face. "Why won't they stand and fight?" he muttered, breath ragged. Armand gave the grim answer, "Because they don't have to." The Khwarezmians had baited the charge perfectly, and now they circled back to kill. By mid-afternoon, the battlefield had transformed into a vast, swirling cauldron of dust, screams, and splintered hopes. The Crusader charge, once a proud spearhead, had dissolved into isolated knots of riders fighting for breath, for footing, for survival. And now the Khwarezmians struck with the precision of predators closing in on wounded prey. Walter of Brienne realized the trap only when he saw the horizon shift, dark shapes rising behind the charging knights, spreading wide like wings. The Khwarezmians had wheeled around in a great arc, sealing the Crusaders off from their own infantry. The allied Damascenes watched helplessly as a wall of horse archers cut them away from the cavalry, arrows raining down in lethal sheets. "Fall back! Fall back!" Walter shouted, but the wind carried his words nowhere. Only those closest heard him, and even they could barely maneuver through the chaos. Armand de Perigord's voice thundered above the din. "Regroup on me. shields high. The Templars tightened into a defensive knot, their discipline holding even under the relentless barrage. Arrows clattered against their shields like hail on iron rooftops. But discipline wasn't enough. A sudden wave of Khwarezmian lancers crashed into them from the side. Horses collided, lances snapped, men were hurled to the ground. A Templar next to Armand was impaled clean through, lifted from his saddle like a rag doll. Blood sprayed across Armand's visor, blinding him for a heartbeat. He wiped it away and saw the horizon crawling with enemies. To the south, the Ayyubid infantry advanced at last, not to save the Crusaders, but to seal their doom. Their archers loosed volleys into the already fractured Christian ranks. A Damascene commander screamed at his men to hold formation, but panic rippled through them as Khwarezmian riders crashed into their flank. One of the Damascene soldiers cried out, "We're betrayed! They've left us to die." "No," his captain growled, parrying a blow. "We were abandoned the moment they charged." On a small ridge, Walter watched everything collapse in minutes. Rage flickered in him. Rage at himself, at the Templars, at fate. He smashed his gauntlet against his saddle horn. "All units, pull back to the hill. We form a last line there." But the order was meaningless. The Khwarezmian ring tightened like a noose. Every path out was blocked. Every breath tasted of dust and blood. The Crusader knights were no longer an army. They were quarry, hunted in every direction. The fields near La Forbie shook beneath a storm of hooves and screams. By late afternoon, the sun had begun its slow descent, casting long, bloody shadows over the battlefield. What remained of the Crusader cavalry fought in desperate circles, small, doomed islands drowning in an ocean of enemies. Armand de Perigord refused to yield. Surrounded by a dwindling cluster of Templars, he fought like a man possessed, his sword a blur of white fury. Every strike cut deep, every parry rang like a funeral bell. But each moment, more Khwarezmian horsemen slammed into them, chipping away at the last disciplined core of the Christian host. "Marshal, we can't hold!" a Templar shouted. Shields split nearly in half. Armand didn't look back. Then die standing. Nearby, a Hospitaller detachment attempted to break through the ring. Their commander, Brother Matthew, led a mad charge against the Khwarezmians, hoping to punch a hole wide enough for a retreat. The first impact threw riders to the ground, but for a heartbeat, just a heartbeat, it seemed they might succeed. Then a second wave of Khwarezmian lancers smashed into their flank. Matthew's horse collapsed beneath him, legs cut out by a sweeping blade. He hit the ground, rolled, raised his shield, and vanished under a rain of hooves and steel. Walter of Brienne, his armor dented and helm cracked, tried again and again to rally the scattered knights. "To me! Form on me!" he roared, voice raw. A handful obeyed, riding toward him through the carnage. But before they could reach him, a torrent of arrows tore them apart. Men he had known for decades, champions of Jaffa, veterans of countless skirmishes, fell in seconds. Walter's horse reared, an arrow lodged in its neck. He crashed to the ground, breath knocked from his lungs. A Khwarezmian rider swooped in, spear lowered, but a Damascene soldier, fleeing in terror, collided with him, knocking the horse sideways. Walter scrambled to his feet, dazed, alive only by accident. All around him, the Crusader lines dissolved completely. Knights dropped their swords, fighting now with daggers or bare fists. Horses stumbled, blood soaking their reins. The air stank of sweat, iron, dust, and the unmistakable scent of hopelessness. A Hospitaller limped past Walter, armor hanging in tatters. "My lord, is there any place left to hold?" Walter looked at the field, at the dead, the dying, the circling enemies. "No," he said quietly, "only to die well." At La Forbie, the knightly orders did not break easily, but they broke. While the knights were being carved apart in the open plain, the allied infantry, Damascenes, local levies, archers from the coastal towns, struggled to hold a shrinking pocket of ground near a shallow ravine. What had begun as an orderly defensive line was now a frantic mass of shields and spears pressed together by sheer terror. Arrows fell on them like rain. Men crouched behind cracked shields, hearing nothing but the thrum of bowstrings and the screams of those unlucky enough to expose even an inch of flesh. Officers shouted to maintain formation, but their voices were swallowed by the chaos. Al-Mansur Ibrahim, the Damascene commander, stood at the center, face streaked with dust and sweat. He had warned the Crusaders. He had argued, pleaded, even threatened. Now he watched the consequences unfolding around him. A captain approached, blood running from a gash across his forehead. "My lord, we cannot hold. The knights are gone." "Then we hold without them," Ibrahim said. "Better to die with discipline than flee like cattle." His voice didn't tremble, but the men around him saw the truth in his eyes. This pocket was doomed. To their right, the Ayyubid infantry advanced methodically, shields raised, spears layered in a deadly hedge. On the left, the Khwarezmians swept in with horrifying speed, riding down isolated groups, cutting through archers as if they were reeds by a riverbank. The two forces closed like the jaws of a trap. A Damascene standard-bearer cried out as a Khwarezmian spear pinned him to the ground. The banner fell. Panic surged. "Hold the line!" Ibrahim roared, grabbing the fallen banner and lifting it himself. For a moment, the infantry steadied. Spears braced, shields locked, a fragile wall in a collapsing world. But then the enemy hit. The impact shattered what little cohesion remained. Men were thrown back, trampled, crushed. Ayyubid soldiers poured into the gaps, cutting down fleeing levies. The ground turned slick with blood and churned mud. Screams mingled with the clatter of steel and the frantic prayers of dying men. A young Damascene archer clutched his bow, trembling. "Commander, will any of us escape?" Ibrahim looked toward the horizon. No reinforcements, no dust cloud of friendly riders, no hope, only the tightening ring of their enemies. He placed a steady hand on the archer's shoulder. "Not today." The Allied line buckled, bent, then finally snapped. What had been a disciplined force dissolved into scattered survivors running for their lives. At La Forbie, the last fragile hope of resisting the Khwarezmian-Egyptian alliance collapsed completely. As the sun bled into the horizon, the battlefield at La Forbie became a charnel ground. Twilight cast long shadows over the dead, stretching them into grotesque silhouettes across the trampled earth. The cries of battle no longer thundered. They lingered as broken, scattered echoes, fading beneath the relentless thrum of Khwarezmian hooves as they hunted the last survivors. Walter of Brienne staggered through the carnage, helmet lost, face smeared with dust and blood. Each breath burned. Each step felt like wading through wet clay. Around him, isolated groups of knights fought with the desperation of cornered beasts, circles of steel shrinking under the weight of thousands. He saw a hospitaller, surrounded by 5 enemies, swing until his sword snapped. Then he fought with the crossguard, then with his fists. He didn't stop until he was cut down. Walter forced himself to look away. To the north, Armand de Perigord made his final stand. The Templar marshal, bleeding from half a dozen wounds, still rode as if he commanded legions rather than a handful of broken survivors. His voice, hoarse but unyielding, carried across the plain. "Brothers, with me, hold!" A cluster of Templars rallied around him, forming one last shielded knot. The Khwarezmians descended on them like wolves. Lances pierced their formation. Horses crushed men under iron-shod hooves. A Templar banner fell, then another. Armand cut down a rider, then another, until a spear thrust burst through his side. He dropped to his knees, still gripping his sword, refusing to bow. A Khwarezmian struck him across the jaw with a mace. The marshal toppled, the last Templar not dissolved. Walter saw it happen. A wave of sickness rolled through him. Not fear, not even grief, but the crushing realization that the military orders, the backbone of the Crusader States for a century and a half, had been broken beyond repair. 90% of their knights lay dead across the field. The Damascenes were annihilated, the coastal levies gone. The rest scattered into the darkening plain, chased down one by one. Walter tried to rally a few remaining riders. "Form on me, this way, toward the marsh." But before he could gather 10 men, a fresh wave of Khwarezmian horsemen cut them off. Arrows whistled. A spear slammed into Walter's thigh, knocking him to the ground. He struggled to rise, teeth clenched in agony. Above him, a Khwarezmian rider raised his blade. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the Crusader States died with it. Night swallowed La Forbie, but the killing did not end with the sunset. Only when exhaustion dulled even the fury of the Khwarezmians did the battlefield fall quiet. An eerie, suffocating quiet that seemed to mourn the dead more honestly than any prayer could. When dawn finally crept over the horizon, it revealed a nightmare stretched from one end of the plain to the other. Armor lay twisted like broken shells. Horses collapsed in tangled heaps. The bodies of knights, damascenes, levies, friend and foe alike, covered the earth so completely that in many places the ground itself disappeared beneath them. For the few who survived, waking was a punishment. Walter of Brienne opened his eyes to the metallic taste of blood and the stench of death baking under the rising sun. Somehow, during the night, the Khwarezmians had assumed him dead and left him among the heaps of corpses. His thigh throbbed with a spear wound, sticky with dried blood. Every limb felt carved from stone. He pushed himself up, choking on dust. "God, have mercy," he whispered, not as a prayer, but as a broken observation of the horror around him. Here and there, wounded men groaned, some begging for water, others begging for death. Khwarezmian riders trotted calmly through the field, finishing off the living with swift efficiency. Walter froze, lying still until they passed. A few yards away, he recognized a familiar cloak, the torn, blood-soaked mantle of the Hospitallers. Brother Raymond, the young knight who had once asked if they would see nightfall, stared lifelessly at the sky. Walter closed the boy's eyes with a trembling hand. To the east, thin pillars of smoke rose where the Ayyubid forces had made camp. Their victory was complete, their casualties minimal, their path into the remaining Crusader territories unobstructed. La Forbie had not been a defeat. It was execution. News spread like wildfire in the following weeks. The Christian garrisons across the Levant, Acre, Tyre, Caesarea, the last fragile remnants of Outremer, fell into a panic. Without the military orders, without the veteran knights, without leadership, the Crusader states were stripped of their spine. Even the Mongols, the looming force reshaping the world, could not undo what had happened here. This single battle erased a century and a half of crusading presence in the Holy Land. Walter, dragging himself toward the marshes, felt the weight of that truth settle on him like a stone he would carry for the rest of his days, however few remained. La Forbie was not just a battlefield. It was the grave of an era.